Mass Psychosis on the Left. This is part 3 of a video series on mass psychosis on the left and right. And this is Jonathan Zapp of zapporacle.com, speaking from the high desert of Boulder, Colorado, a mile above the sea level portion of the Babylon Matrix. And I'm going to start with a personal note because about my state of mind, because I think that we all have to have the humility to recognize the limits of our ability to have any objectivity at all. And I remember I was talking to a well-educated conspiracy theorist who said to me, well, I'm just objectively like analyzing facts. And I could not resist at that moment just laughing out loud. And I think it set him back, and he began to realize that my laughter was justified. And when I told him there are no objective observers on this earth, okay, we're talking about things that our fellow primates are doing, and none of us can claim to have perfect objectivity. And that's why I tell people, take everything I say with a grain of salt, fact check me, correct me. That was the tradition of aggressive Socratic dialogue I was brought up in. Take what resonates with your inner truth sense and feel free to push back on the rest. Anyway, so I've been feeling super stressed by this upcoming election, and I've been kind of checking myself to see, is it really about that? Because, people can often project their own neurotic symptoms onto something outside themselves and so forth. But I think I'm a pretty self-aware person who's constantly checking for that kind of thing. And the stress, which I haven't always been conscious of because I've been busy like entertaining out-of-town guests recently and so forth, is being picked up constantly by especially my fourth generation Oura Ring. It's sending me stress warnings, and so is the Apple Watch I wear at night to get a further biometric feedback of my sleep quality and this kind of thing. And they're both picking this up. And I think it is the election. And I think it derives from my ancestry, because I had an intense fear of like another Holocaust since I was a child. I grew up with Holocaust survivors. My dad was a D-Day survivor who never fully recovered psychologically from the trauma of D-Day. So I kind of grew up in the atmosphere of the fear of mass psychosis because so many of my relatives had lived through that and even lost their lives because of it. So, for example, I was given the Hebrew name of the father of my Uncle Harry, who died in the camps. So this has kind of been with me for a long time. But my conscious mind is kind of philosophical about light and dark. I am the creator of my own philosophy called dynamic paradoxicalism, where, and my sci-fi epic Parallel Journeys is what I call a trans-Manichaean story. It's beyond the simple duality of good and evil. I realize that things are paradoxical related to light and dark, that we don't know enough to know what's good news and bad news. Maybe, if Trump were elected, maybe, when people discovered he couldn't fix things really quickly, maybe they would wake up from the delusions on the right. Of course, I had that same hope in 2016. It didn't pan out. But it's kind of regardless of my conscious attitude, which I can work on, because it is something that is arousing ancestral fears of collective psychosis and making me feel very agitated and even a little bit physically unwell because of it. Because we have somebody who is talking just in the last few days about using the military to deal with the enemy within. This is what the Jews were called in Nazi Germany. And he's talking about people like the Jewish congressman running for Senate, Adam Schiff, and Nancy Pelosi, and people who may be wrong about things and might have corrupt aspects or whatever. But this is kind of unprecedented to have a former president talking about using the military, which of course is completely against U.S. law to use the military against U.S. citizens. But this is basically him announcing, hey, I'm planning on being a military dictator. And I don't care to live under a military dictatorship. So this is a little bit upsetting. And does it mean that I am wildly enthusiastic about Harris? No, I'm not. I am voting much more against Trump and totalitarianism, fascism, than I am voting for Harris. If there were a better candidate, that would be great. But it's a binary choice. There are only two viable candidates. Only one of them will be the next president. And it's a very easy choice, given the things that if you just take what Trump says in his own words. So before I start casting shade on people on collective psychosis on the left, which I will certainly be doing in this video, we have to be able to choose between the lesser of two evils. We have to be able to recognize in our grade-scaled world who is wearing the very, very dark gray hat and who is wearing the medium gray hat and this kind of thing. And that's a very important difference. And so, for example, if we just go by what Trump himself says, for example, almost 2023, late in early December of 2022, this is what Trump, I'm not changing a word, not editing anything, this is his truth that he posted on his social media platform, Truth Social. Now, if you think the election was stolen, you're probably totally unreachable. But most people, even the ones I debate on the right, realize that he's a sore loser, that it was not stolen, because if you believe that nonsense, then you're unreachable by reason. So, assuming you at least understand that fact, just listen carefully to what Trump had to say. It's not very long. Do you throw the presidential election results of 2020 out and declare the rightful winner, all caps, or do you have a new election? A massive fraud of this type and magnitude allows for, pay close attention, the termination of all rules, regulations, and articles, even those found in the Constitution. Okay, so based on his big lie, he is saying that he would throw out the Constitution. Okay, there may be many stupid policies on the Democratic side. There are. Okay, but here is somebody telling you that they want to end the 240-year fragile experiment with democracy and throw out the Constitution. Okay, that makes it a very easy choice to vote for any functioning adult, even if they're wrong on a lot of important things, that could be president instead of somebody who would say that. Because the whole idea of America was to not be ruled by a king. That's what 1776 was all about. We didn't want to be ruled by King George, okay? And the whole idea of the design of the Constitution and what the Founding Fathers had in mind was checks and balances to keep a would-be despot from seizing power. And the Founding Fathers warned us about this in no uncertain terms. So this is from an LA Times article. I give the link in the notes. You want to look up the actual article, but I'm reading from it now. Less than 2 weeks after the start of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, George Washington wrote to his friend, the Marquis de Lafayette, on June 6, 1787, explaining that his critical purpose in attending the convention was to prevent a demagogue from gaining power in the politically unstable young nation, and thus destroying it. Washington described how he was pulled out of retirement by an urgent risk to the United States. Anarchy and confusion, in quotes, were threatening the security of the American people and the rule of constitutional law, but this was only half the danger. The deeper risk, he wrote that early June, was that the political chaos created fertile ground for exploitation, quote, and I'm putting in quotes within the article to indicate George Washington speaking or writing, quote, by some aspiring demagogue who will not consult the interests of his country so much as his own ambitious views, unquote. Washington, of course, was not the only framer who viewed our Constitution largely as a bulwark against demagogues. In the surviving records of the speeches given at the Constitutional Convention, the word demagogue was used 21 times by the framers as they crafted the Constitution's essential checks and balances against despotism and tyranny. Voters in this country are on the verge of giving an electoral, so this is me speaking now, voters in this country are on the verge of giving an electoral college victory, or could give a victory to. We don't know the outcome yet. It's 8 days away when I'm speaking on October 28th of 2024. To a man who tried a coup to hold on to power and is explicitly telling you that he intends to suspend the Constitution and be a military dictator. So this is not time to throw whataboutisms around about what about what Biden and Harris did with the border, which sucked, which was terrible. Yes, Afghanistan was a disaster. I mean, I can go through a long list of things wrong with Biden and Harris. If there was a better candidate, and they're not the same person, obviously, but if there was a better candidate who had not had such bad policies, I would gladly consider them, but we don't have that luxury. We have a choice between politics as usual, within the usual range of being wrong, and a would-be dictator. And so, yes, wokeism is a motherlode of stupid ideas. Yes, there are lots of stupid, horrifying things on the left. But this is going to be the general theme here, is that the mass psychosis on the left is probably more obnoxious, though they're both highly obnoxious, but it's far more dangerous on the right. And so this is why I have focused, at least in the previous video, on the mass psychosis on the right, because that's the one threatening to take down the whole democracy. And so when we look at history, I mean, not just history, but what's going on in the world where democracies are shrinking and countries ruled by totalitarians are growing, we see a long history of demagogues taking over countries and suspending elections. It usually begins with, an election, with an actual outcome or a fraudulent one that allows the dictator to take over. They will continue to have a constitution and courts and so forth nominally, and they will continue to have elections, but the elections will become rigged. And we see this going on over, do you really believe, Putin and Russia are having valid elections? Though most of the Russian people do support him because of all the propaganda. But, look at what happened so recently in Venezuela. That was not, we all know that was not an actual election. So I'm not aware of countries that have been taken over by woke folks. Okay. They could be highly dangerous if you gave them the keys to the country, but the historic and the present record of what's going on with nations is that the most acute danger is a right-wing totalitarian fascist taking over the country. So the greater danger of the collective psychosis on the right is also apparent from the point of view of, I'm no expert on it, but there's an evolutionary model called spiral dynamics, and it has different, it calls them memes for whatever reason. There are different colors that represent different levels of like group psychological development. So the people from the woke category, like hippies and like new age people, and more of the kind of people that I've been surrounded by quite a bit, are part of what's called the green meme. And the green meme is basically a rebellion from the false hierarchies of patriarchy. So it's a rebellion from all of these hierarchies where hereditary kings and someone wearing a badge or a uniform can have the power of life and death over you, even if they're like a highly prejudiced, unintelligent person. I'm not saying that that categorizes all police or anything like that, but where you can, but that would be an example of a false hierarchy where, you know, an SS trooper has the guns and you don't, and they have power over you. And so what we have with the green meme is what Heraclitus called an enantiodromia. That is when you slide from one extreme to another. So in the rebellion from hierarchy, people in the green meme tend to be completely anti-hierarchical. Meanwhile, nature is hierarchical, right? That's why we have an apex predator and so forth. There are hierarchies throughout nature. There's a hierarchy with all human abilities. My opinion about someone's brain tumor is not as good as a brain surgeon's. You know, people say, well, that's just your opinion, you know, and, you know, no one's opinion, everyone deserves a voice. No one's opinion is more valid than another. No, that's not true. Some people know a lot more than others. There is a hierarchy in physical types. That's why I don't get many recruitment calls from the NBA. You know, we can say, like, why doesn't the NBA look more like America? Well, I don't know, but it doesn't. But we don't try and correct that. But for some reason, I'm kind of getting a little bit off topic because this is getting into wokeism. In areas where it would advantage certain groups, things have to look more like America. But that's not said about, say, the NBA. Anyway, and why? Because the NBA is a meritocracy, as it should be. It should not. Basketball players are not hired or fired based on their race, as far as I know, but based on their merit. How good are they at sinking baskets and blocking shots and stuff like that? And so then it just looks like however it looks based on merit. Okay, there are not very many Jewish NBA players. Okay, I don't protest that because in a meritocracy, you let the best win and you let the best rise to the top. And that's a good thing. That's a natural hierarchy. So this is one of the reasons why it's much less, mass psychosis is less dangerous on the left, is because it's ruled by the green meme that's so anti-hierarchical they can't organize themselves well enough. Like, I go to rainbow gatherings, which I totally support and love, but they're extremely green meme and anti-hierarchical so that nobody can be in charge by the principles of the rainbow gathering. At most, you're a focalizer, organizing something, but nobody is in charge. But that also means, which is great in some ways, we don't get some crazy boss trying to take it over, but we can also have people stand in a meadow for 2 weeks just trying to figure out where the next gathering will be, because no one's opinion is given more weight than another's. So this is why the Occupy movement fell apart, even though, what's her name? I forget. There's some left-wing kind of person who, Pacifica Radio or something. She spoke confidently that the Occupy movement was like the fall of patriarchy and this kind of thing. But it didn't hold together because no one could be in charge of it. And if no one can be in charge of an organization, it's not very effective. So that doesn't mean good or bad. It just means effectiveness. The Nazis could be very effective for a while because they did have a hierarchy, and they had no one saying, oh, well, that's just Hitler's opinion. It's no more valid than mine. No, they were able to pledge allegiance to a dictator. And so those kind of people are, the fascists are from, I think, the orange meme. That's an earlier, more primitive level of psychological development. You can find it in a biker gang, but they're more effective when it comes to violence and taking over than people who are totally anti-hierarchical, and they have more guns. So this is why we should be more concerned about the mass psychosis on the right, even though we have it on the left, and I will be mostly talking about that. So let's go right into that. But let me just say something about woke people in general. Then I'm going to read you something I wrote on woke racism, so it'll be a little better organized. But when I have had personal interactions with woke people, basically what I see are church ladies in drag. They may have dreadlocks, they may have piercings, but they may have funky colored hair or whatever, but they're basically a bunch of irate church ladies with crosses burning in their eyes, ready to cast out any heretic that disagrees with them at all, who uses certain words they've forbidden, and so forth. And these are people who are very psychologically naive, most of whom have had a Christian or Muslim ancestry, and yet they act as if they are born tabula rasa, like a blank slate, and that they've just become autonomously enlightened and free of error, and they conveniently omit to take into account that their ancestors were mostly all Orthodox religionists who were extremely punishing to infidels, to people who disagreed with their religious tenets, and were rabidly anti-Semitic. But they feel that they are, even though they exhibit all kinds of anti-Semitism, they feel that they are, this has nothing to do with their ancestry and the world's oldest hate and the fact that their ancestors were rabidly anti-Semitic as they are. They feel as if they're newly born and are not contaminated by the horrors of their ancestral past, though they want others to have collective guilt for things that their ancestors did, and feel that others, namely white folk, are forever racist because of their ancestors and their wrongs. So we just find all these incredible, obvious inconsistencies in their thinking. There's not thinking, because anybody thinking for a minute would realize the total contradictions. I've had friends who had some little amulet on and was told that's cultural appropriation. You can't wear that. But how would one of those woke people feel if I, as a Jewish person, were to go up to a black person eating a bagel and slap the bagel out of their hand and accuse them of cultural appropriation for eating a Jewish ethnic food? That would, they would, that would never even occur to them, the gross inconsistency of that, or the fact that human cultures have always worked by cultural appropriation. Cultures are all mix and match, wherever we have any kind of geographical contact, or even through the collective unconscious, without even geographical contact, we all are cultural appropriators and should be. That's how the human species works. Anyway, let's get to that article on woke racism. So this article was originally provoked by a tweet that a young Gen Z aged friend, who I didn't know that well, but he reposted this tweet on his Facebook timeline, and it was from a person of color who calls himself Transmac Thought for whatever reason. Maybe that's his actual name. I don't know. And it says, reminder to white people, you will continue to mess up RE racism, so continue to be teachable, open to correction from POC, persons of color, in other words, your betters, who know everything about the human shadow better than you do, and permanently so, and vigilantly monitor yourself for defensiveness and white fragility. You never arrive as an ally. You must continually practice allyship. And this is what they're saying to those who are sympathetic to their point of view. And so then when I objected to the perspective of this tweet, that friend instantly canceled me. There was no rebuttal, no nothing, just instant cancellation because of the sheer racist affront of my disagreeing with a person of color, my better, in other words. How dare I, when I should be just apologizing for being white and being, instructed by persons of color in anything. Okay, so here's what I wrote in very irritated response. Reminder to woke folk. And I know the history of the woke term. It started out as a good thing of being more aware of social injustice. It's just because we don't need some kind of a term to talk about people who are completely possessed by a mass psychosis on the left. But I also dislike it. I think it was a good term to become pejorative because the idea of being woke, of being awake, and that others are asleep is an instant red flag because all of us are to some extent asleep. To the extent that we have wakefulness, it's something we have to earn moment by moment. So whenever somebody tells other people, like Alex Jones, say like, wake up, sheeple, that's instantly a sign that they are asleep. Okay? People need to work on waking themselves up much more than other people because especially if they don't acknowledge that they're partially asleep. Okay. Reminder to woke folk, you will continue to mess up due to pretentious and self-righteous ideologies that cause you to think yourselves entitled to correct others, not privileged in woke subculture by a special status, however oppressed historically and in the present day. So this is part of the feature of wokeism is that they say, well, my voice deserves to be here, even if they have no idea what they're talking about, but your voice deserves to be heard only to the extent that you belong to some privileged, in wokeism, victim group. If you're a white guy, you have no status at all. You should just shut up, apologize, and be instructed by your betters, who are persons of color or trans or whatever. But you have no ability to have your own independent thoughts. So, this is me speaking again. Take off your unearned merit badge you think entitles you to be on the prowl to call out the supposed microaggressions of others without ever turning such critical scrutiny on yourself. If you, Transmac Thought, had substituted we for you, your post might not have broadcast this sort of woke arrogance and ignorance. Your naive assumption is that a non-white person need never worry or work continually to check their racism and prejudices. Any statement beginning with black people, white people, men, women, straight people, gay people, as in the white people of this post, is stereotyped, ignorant, and wrong by definition. The obvious reason is that any group of people is wildly divergent and varied. Let's take me, for example, as an older white guy. I am not descended from slave masters, nor my ancestors here during that era. My grandparents barely escaped anti-Semitic pogroms in Eastern Europe, Ukraine, and Latvia. My dad was a leading figure in the Socialist Leninist Party, and both parents were active in the civil rights movement. And it wasn't just politics. My mom's best friend for decades was a black woman. When New York public school teachers like my dad went on strike in the late 60s, it was a bit of a shock to the family when we found black folk who were protesting the strike for bogus reasons were passing out copies of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the notorious anti-Semitic forgery created by the Tsar's secret police, the very document that had been used to incite the violent pogroms my grandparents had to escape. It was part of the growing phenomenon that they were finally becoming aware of, or at least I was becoming aware of black anti-Semitism and reverse racism. Not that that was a new thing, but it was probably a shock to my parents. I grew up in a very multiracial Bronx where I had the opportunity to get beaten up by children of all races, creeds, and colors. When I was 12, my parents, who believed in public education, everybody in the family worked in public education, including me for 14 years, allowed me to be sent to a junior high in the South Bronx to further integration. So let me explain that a little bit. It's probably the biggest mistake my parents made in my upbringing. They were great parents in all kinds of other ways, but to further integration, though the elementary school I went to, PS 86, these schools had numbers instead of names sometimes, was very integrated and very multiracial. But that wasn't good enough. So they drew a zoning line through my block. I was 2 houses on the south side of that zoning line and was going to be sent, where I'd have to take a long public bus ride to the South Bronx to junior high school 79. Had I been 2 houses north of that line, or 1 house north of that line, just a few hundred feet away, I would have gone to junior high school 149, where most of my friends were going. That was in Riverdale. That's where Archie Comics takes place. And I would have had a completely different experience, a much better one, for 2 years. But my parents were purists with ethics. I mean, they were such purists that, that they tithed their money and would give 10% to charity, and then refused to declare that those charitable donations on their income tax, because they said then it's not really charity. That money should go to the government and this kind of thing. So they were very ideologically pure. And so they, because what they could have done, we had a relative who was just like 2 blocks north of that line, could have used their address. That's what a lot of people did. But that would be cheating. And so they wanted to stay faithful to the principle of integration. So they allowed me to be sent to a place where I was subject to constant violence for 2 years. And this is a problem you have. I get why that sounds like it's ethical and ideologically pure. They're not going to do something to cheat integration. But when an ideology doesn't match real world conditions, you've really got to rethink that ideology. So in that junior high in the South Bronx, I experienced 2 brutal years that resulted in PTSD symptoms, to where, if somebody made a sudden movement when I was in college. I went to college when I was 16. I escaped the Bronx, but that was after 3 years of Bronx High School of Science, where I had much less violence, none at the school, but some on the street still. But I would flinch out of the way because I was so used to fending off blows and this kind of thing. But I don't need any trigger warnings about violence. I'm not a snowflake. To be honest, the traumas of what I experienced with the physical violence for 2 years were nothing compared to the emotional trauma of failed relationships and things like that. Because it was a long time ago, and those other traumas were more recent. Anyway, I was specifically targeted in that school for my race and religion. I was one of a few white kids in a mostly black and Hispanic school when there was an explosion of rage, understandable, especially from the black community against whites. And I was at ground zero for that explosion of rage. And so I was specifically targeted for my race and my religion, and was throughout my childhood. There were kids that would come up to me on Kingsbridge Road and would recognize me as Jewish just from my looks and be like, "You Jew? You Jew?" And would be ready to kick my ass because of my race and religion. But that doesn't count as racism, according to woke people, apparently. That's something that only persons of color experience. And their head cannot just take into account that a white person, a very white person like me, could have been the target of racism from the other direction. So I was specifically targeted by a group of Black Nation of Islam kids. That was Louis Farrakhan's organization, who all had X in their names, as in Malcolm X, and so forth. That's how I discovered what was going on when I saw a list of the kids who were attacking me, and they all had X in the middle of their name. Malcolm X, who was part of the Nation of Islam originally, was told by his leader, Elijah Muhammad, that whites were blue-eyed devils. Unlike so many of the present woke folk, Malcolm, who was an extremely intelligent guy, decided to educate himself outside of his rigid box of conditioned beliefs. This caused him to diverge from the Nation of Islam ideology and ultimately led to his assassination. Malcolm went to Mecca to see the source of Islamic culture for himself. He discovered there were blonde-haired, blue-eyed Muslims because Islam, though woke people call those who critique Islam racists, is not a race, but a religion, and has members of every race in it. Duh. He was also shocked to find that children belonging to the extended Saudi royal family were often accompanied by black slaves who were carrying their school books. So this was kind of a big wake-up shock for Malcolm X. Historical fact woke folk don't know. Muslims have owned and sold far more slaves than Caucasian Christian folk, and they are the primary group trafficking slaves today and in all-time record numbers. For example, by 750 AD, Islam's African, this is a quote from an excellent book on Islam called The Muhammad Code by Howard Bloom. It's got thousands of footnotes. For example, by 750 AD, Islam's African empire covered roughly 6 million square kilometers, and the multi-continental Muslim trade in African slaves would uproot over 112 million blacks from their homes, would kill 84 million of them, and would put over 28 million blacks on sale in slave markets from one end of the empire of Islam to the other. This outdid the Western slave trade's appalling 11 million black Africans displaced and 1 million killed by a staggering multiple of more than 10 to 1. When Malcolm X's education made him no longer woke enough for rivals in the Nation of Islam, they assassinated him. Malcolm's widow and many others believe the current leader of the Nation of Islam, Louis Farrakhan, was responsible. And in the article, I'll put up a link to the article on woke racism. You can see a New York Times article documenting that. Nevertheless, the reversed racist kids I went to school with and many others blamed Malcolm's assassination on white folk like me who had nothing to do with it. This is too un-PC ever to have been publicly talked about, but for a few years, including when I went to that junior high in the South Bronx, the date of Malcolm's assassination became an informal public school holiday known as Kill Whitey Day. On that date, New York City public schools were closed based on a bland statement that disturbances were expected. All schools closed today. Just now, I finally found a public reference to Kill Whitey Day from someone else who was in the Bronx public schools of that era, and I put up the link in that article. And no, this wasn't a day when the white kids would be subject to linguistic microaggressions if they showed their faces in the wrong hoods. A girl I knew who had been out sick for a couple of weeks and didn't know it was Kill Whitey Day was pulled out of the public bus she had taken to school and was beaten and ganged raped. I barely escaped the viciously racist and anti-Semitic Black Nation of Islam kids with my life. I was thrown down steel staircases multiple times. One of them threw an M80 at my face. I ducked, but the explosion permanently affected my hearing. I experienced a couple of weeks of tinnitus after the M80 exploded near my head, and though I can't prove a causal link, for the last 10 years or so, and probably to continue the rest of my life, I have 24/7 tinnitus. I'm going to correct a typo here. Question to those who would like to throw around the word Islamophobia, which I've been accused of for pointing out some of these things. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, a phobia is a noun, and it refers to an extreme or irrational fear or or an aversion to something. She suffered from a phobia about birds. Phobia is about irrational fear, and therefore it should not be applied to a rational fear of that which is objectively dangerous. If you are trying to escape a rampage shooter, no one will accuse you of bullet phobia. Was I being Islamophobic when I ducked the M80? Perhaps I deprived that Black Nation of Islam kid of a culturally authentic experience of mutilating an infidel Jew. Was Salman Rushdie Islamophobic when in 2022 he tried to get away from an Islamic attacker who stabbed him multiple times, causing him to lose sight in one eye and the use of one hand? As a Jew who was physically attacked by Muslims for 2 years as a child, am I being Islamophobic to be wary of a religion that includes the following sacred hadith? Quote, "Judgment day will not come until the Muslims fight the Jews. The Jews will hide behind the stones and the trees, and the stones and the trees will say, 'O Muslim, O servant of Allah, there is a Jew hiding behind me. Come and kill him.'" Am I being Islamophobic to be concerned about that sacred hadith? Explain it to me. And then there's a link up there to a YouTube, and this is from a source. Let's see, did I identify it? I think I've got the link up there. Known as the Hadith of the Stones and the Trees, this is a quintessential eschatological hadith that is recognized as authentic, i.e. is confidently ascribed to the Prophet Muhammad by the most authoritative sources of prophetic traditions. Dating back to early Islam, this hadith is still prominent in the consciousness of Muslims today and is frequently mentioned in contemporary discourse, e.g. in sermons and in the media and in school curricula, including in the West Bank and Gaza schools. As we have seen, Article 7 of Hamas's charter presents this hadith as relevant to the operative reality of its war. A YouTube, linked in the article, promising that the end of Jews is imminent, shows a Jew hiding behind a tree, which says, it's like a cartoon tree, "O Muslim, O servant of Allah, there is a Jew behind me. Come and kill him." When my father made a complaint to the junior high 79, where I was being targeted for my race and religion by Black Nation of Islam kids, the school became concerned with their liability because of how I was being treated, so an assistant principal every day walked me to the front door of the school after my last class so the beatings would occur off school property. Several years later, I went back to the scene of my childhood torment, the South Bronx in other words, and became an English teacher and the building security coordinator of an all-male public high school in the South Bronx, Samuel Gompers High School, on 143rd Street and Southern Boulevard, at the epicenter of blocks and blocks of burned-out apartment buildings, and not to pay back, but to protect Black and Hispanic kids, basically from other Black and Hispanic kids, so that they could get an education. So I was not there to pay anybody back. I was a super popular teacher throughout my 14-year career. When President Jimmy Carter gave a speech on urban blight, famous speech, it was against the post-apocalyptic backdrop of burnt-out South Bronx hellscape. And that was about a block away from Gompers. It was like the epicenter of the worst part of the South Bronx. This was in the 80s, at the start of the crack epidemic. As dean and building security coordinator, I patrolled the hallways of that school to make sure other kids, nearly 100% black and Hispanic, weren't bullied the way I was. Though I was a short white guy, I was respected and liked by inner city kids because I didn't listen to the sort of ignorant, like that guy whose tweet I quoted, perpetual collective guilt woke advice given in the social media post above. I wasn't afraid to get in their face when that was necessary and didn't feel apologetic because of the color of my skin, and was respected for that. I also took many of those inner city kids, some of whom had rarely been outside the South Bronx, even to take a trip to Manhattan, an easy subway ride, let alone outside the city, on backpacking trips to Harriman State Park at my own expense. How many woke folk who want to lecture me about BLM and race issues have actually put their lives on the line to protect black and brown people? I did every workday for 6 years, and I mean that quite literally. After I left Gompers, metal detectors were installed at the front door, but we had no way of screening people for weapons while I was there. A student named Eric Blagrove went to Rikers Island for attempted manslaughter of me. He came to school to kill me with a machete. There were numerous violent incidents. Mostly I kept hallways empty between classes and broke up fights. And some of this is explained in my sci-fi novel, Parallel Journeys, the actual events that occurred. While I was working at Gompers, I finally met someone who really knew what it was like to get violently bullied. Not some woke snowflake type subject to supposed microaggressions and various linguistic insensitivities, but someone else subject to macroaggressions such as getting the shit kicked out of you for your race or religion. This was my late Palestinian brother-in-law, Jamal, who grew up in Palestine, the West Bank, where he was also brutalized by Muslims because he was an Arab Christian Palestinian. Okay, so people who want to call me Islamophobic racist, okay, Islam is not a race. Arabs are not all Muslims. Some are Christians, for example. So woke folk, be careful when you self-righteously tell whole groups of other folk who they are and how they should behave. They might be more diverse and hard to categorize than you think. PC woke culture has pathologized into an overcorrection of valid past and present abuses of various groups. It has now become a set of blinders, a template that encourages shadow projection onto some groups while practicing shadow denial with other groups. Notice that stripped of the group names, this is exactly what white supremacists do. Now, I kind of promised myself I'm not going to get into the Middle Eastern conflict because that's such a complex rabbit hole, and I don't begin to have it's a full-time job to really understand all the complexity of what's going on in the Middle East. I am not and never have been a supporter of Netanyahu or his government. He was somebody who, from the first second I laid eyes on him, I felt physically sick. I knew this guy was trouble. I knew this guy was just a raging, arrogant asshole. However, there is blatant anti-Semitism in amongst many of the college campus protesters who say they are Hamas, not realizing that this is an outfit that has genocide of Jews everywhere as their official policy and would like to create another Holocaust. What does the river to the sea mean? Look at a map. That would be all the Jews who live in Israel. Okay, a lot of people have a very warped idea of when Gad Saad, who wrote an excellent book, though I do not agree with the guy on everything, called The Parasitic Mind. So there's no need for me to really go through and psychoanalyze everything about the collective psychosis of wokeism, because people have written excellent books about it like that. When he asked Joe Rogan how many Jews he thought there were, he estimated about 1 billion. Okay, the actual answer is 14 million. Our numbers haven't even fully recovered from the Holocaust that occurred in living memory, and was experienced by people I actually knew. There are more Jews in 1939. Okay, there are like 1.8 billion Muslims. So the idea that, and when I was growing up, genocide meant you were trying to kill a whole race of people. It's been reinterpreted to become almost meaningless now, to like refer to any atrocity. I mean, we have a perfectly good word, atrocity, for atrocities. It's not a genocide as far as I'm concerned, unless you're trying to kill a whole race of people. 14 million Jews, 8 million of which live in Israel, cannot possibly commit genocide on what, Arabs, Muslims, or 1.8 billion people spread out over many, many powerful countries. Powerful and wealthy countries, some of the wealthiest on earth, like Saudi Arabia. Anyway, but then I've also heard some of these campus protesters type say that the Israelis are white European colonialists who have invaded Palestine. Okay, so first of all, many Jews are not white. There's a substantial population of very black Ethiopian Jews in Israel, for example. Now, it is the one religious group where you could be accused of racism for being against them actually are Ashkenazi Jews. Why? Because they really do seem to be a race, in that all Ashkenazi Jews, because of a population bottleneck somewhere between 600 and 800 years ago, may be descended from just 350 mothers. So there actually can be a tremendous genetic cohesion amongst Ashkenazi Jews. For example, me. I sent in my DNA to 23andMe, and based on my DNA, not anything else they knew about me, it came back and said 100% Ashkenazi Jewish. That does make me feel racially Jewish. Okay, so let's see. So I just want to say something about the colonial idea. Okay, I mean, if we wanted to talk about colonialism, we would have to talk about Islam, because 70 years after the death of the Prophet, they had conquered a landmass 3 times the size of the Roman Empire, 7 times the landmass of the United States. That wasn't colonialism, and it was done at the point of a sword. Okay, but the idea that the Jews are colonialists is a bit of a stretch. So most people are familiar with a holiday called Christmas. I call it the annual retail festival of 1225. Okay, but what is Christmas about? It's about a Jewish Palestinian boy born in Palestine, in Bethlehem, which is in the West Bank, into a large Jewish family, part of a large Jewish community living in Palestine. Okay, if you go to Jerusalem, you can put your hands on, I have the Wailing Wall. Okay, it's quite big. What is that? That is a wall, the last standing wall left of the second temple that the Jews built in Jerusalem. When did they build that? When was that the center of Jewish life in the whole planet? I think it was built in 531 BC. 560 years before Christianity. 1,300 years before Islam. Okay, so these are the invaders who've been living there continuously for thousands of years. They never fully went away. There were always Jews living in Palestine for the last few thousand years. But this is not known to some of the protesters whose knowledge of history is fuzzy before the birth of TikTok. So, here's a woke fact for your consideration. well, let's see. Okay. I think this is where I left off and went off on these tangents. PC woke culture has pathologized into an overcorrection of valid past and present abuses of various groups. It has now become a set of blinders, a template that encourages shadow projection onto some groups while practicing shadow denial with other groups. Notice that stripped of the group names, this is exactly what white supremacists do. Okay, remember Martin Luther King? What he wanted was a colorblind society where a man's character was more important than the color of their skin. But now woke folk openly reject Martin Luther King's idea. They're like, oh, he said a lot of things, they'll say about that. But they want the color of your skin to be the most important thing about you, not the least, not your character. If you have a white skin, then you need to be working on your inherent racism your entire life and will never be done with the project and so forth. So, but here's a woke fact for your consideration. Every individual and every group has a shadow. White folks have shadows, black folks have shadows, gender fluid folks have shadows, you, me, and all of us have shadows. If you're always talking about a they and their shadow and are not examining your own, then you are dangerously asleep. So this is why when Jung was teaching a seminar in the Weimar Republic and there were Nazis literally goose-stepping out on the streets below, and people said, given the great evils of this, what should we do? And he said, well, begin by first reclaiming your shadow from the world, your shadow projection onto others. Obviously, there were other things that needed to be done, like, fighting the Nazis. But as Goethe said, if you want to clean up the whole world, begin with your doorstep. But I've noticed this with woke people when I worked for environmental nonprofits. And by the way, I also worked for years for a nonprofit supporting Muslim women, supporting organizations like RAWA, the Revolutionary Afghan Women's Association, and especially a burn center in Islamabad, Pakistan, that was for women who had their faces burned off, basically. Because these are sometimes called stove burnings and stuff, because the husband had a dream that his wife was cheating on him, because she laughed out loud in public, because dinner wasn't spiced to his satisfaction. It could be for any reason at all. And the women would be left to die in the street because a woman could not be admitted to a hospital in Pakistan without her husband being present. And so most did not recover when they went to this burn center, but at least they had a fellow Muslim woman holding their hand. According to the UN, there were an amazing number. There's an article on my website called Jihad Against the Feminine by my friend who ran this nonprofit. And there was something like 2,000, it's a large Muslim city, like 10 million, but there were like 2,000 women a month being mutilated in this way at one point that they documented. So this is something that woke people cannot even comprehend, that the worst human rights disaster on the planet, nothing is even a close second, is the treatment of 800 million or so or more women in Islamic fundamentalist regimes, the gender apartheid that they suffer on a daily basis. As Meryl Streep recently gave a talk where she pointed out that a female cat has much more rights than women in Afghanistan under the Taliban, that the cat could go out on the front stoop and sun herself, whereas women have to be kept behind closed doors. So another man, not their husband, can't gaze on them. And the cat could go chase a squirrel into a public park, but women are not allowed in public parks, and so forth and so on. But this is not a proper subject for moral outrage because it's person of color on person of color. And if, political correctness and wokeism is really a template of shadow projection. You're allowed to project a shadow onto Israel, onto globalizing corporations, onto white people, but not onto persons of color. If they do anything that even seems wrong, it's because it's a secondary effect of colonialism or something that white people did. But they forget that Islam was a world conquering colonial force, totally racist, totally wrapped up with slavery, before there was an Israel, a USA, or a globalizing corporation. Anyway, no one is woke. Being awake is a moment-by-moment struggle for degrees of wakefulness. When you hear anyone talking about waking people up, you're listening to a dangerous sleepwalker. Conspiratists like Alex Jones say things like, "Wake up, sheeple." The unquestioned assumption of those calling others to wake up is that they are awake. So that's what makes even that term woke so obnoxious. Actually, they are more likely to be what Jung called those terrifying invalids who think they're on a mission to save the world. Every group, every person has a shadow, and no one is more dangerously asleep than self-righteous folk calling out the shadows of other individuals and groups without scrutinizing their individuals and group shadows. So if you're taking a complex conflict like what's going on in Gaza, and you're like, oh, well, here are the guys with the white hats, Hamas, and here are the guys with the black hats, the Jewish Israelis, then you're in a state of total shadow projection. There are, like in almost every conflict, perpetrators and victims on both sides. It's always going to be more complicated than you think it is. So, folk of any kind, okay, I guess I already talked about some of that. And there's a picture there of from a Boulder Weekly from Modern Acupuncture, and it shows a highly tattooed woman, and it says, "Be a Zen goddess." Hey, woke person, are you a Zen goddess or an uptight church lady in drag? Because I actually know a young woman, very indulgent in some ways, but she put up an ad on Facebook for housemates and said, myself and 2 other goddesses are looking for a sister to join our household. But they would have a fit if a male, even if it was a hot young male with a lot of tattoos, called themselves a god. Okay, you're not an archetype. You're not a goddess. You're a neurotic person. And so then there are some follow-ups. I greatly endorse the writings like the book Woke Racism by John McWhorter, who's a black Columbia University linguist. And he talks about how anti-racism now functions as a religion. Found McWhorter's analysis extremely interesting because for decades I've noticed a proliferation of secular fundamentalist religions. For example, I wrote a long paper in the 80s about how diets and eating disorders functioned essentially as obsessive religions. A wonderful recent book called Diet Cults expands this theme. Multi-level marketing schemes have a revival tent hysteria with a charismatic preacher and promises of salvation and so forth. People love to invent their own narcissistic religions. And there's so much evidence of this, and Trumpism and QAnon certainly function as religions. There's certainly very little rationalism involved, or rationality involved. I was having a pleasant conversation with a lesbian undergraduate a few years ago who is majoring in gender studies when I included Islam amongst a list of regressive patriarchal forces. With perfect, woke, adamant, and self-righteous certainty, she stated flatly, "Islam is not repressive," whereupon she instantly shut down the conversation, turned heels, and walked away from me. Of course, from the point of view of belief conservation, she was right to do so, because given an opportunity to respond, I would have pointed out that the treatment of nearly 1 billion women under Islam is by far the greatest human rights disaster on the planet, nothing even a close second, a vast gender apartheid that exists not in one country, but in many Islamic nations. That Islam, some of this I've already said. But according to the Hadith, something else that's not talked about when they talk about this religion of peace, and it's not that I'm a scholar of Islam, though I've read quite a number of books, and I was part of that nonprofit helping Islamic women through Islamic women-run organizations. But you hear this thing amongst people who are woefully ignorant of Islam. And my mom was like this too. She was like, oh, well, these are just extremists misrepresenting the religion, or Bernie Sanders. It's a religion of peace, and so on. No, it isn't. Okay? Read the Quran and the Hadiths. And this religion has been of peace, has always been a world conquest ideology. I already mentioned how it conquered a landmass 7 times the size of the USA by the sword 70 years after the death of the Prophet. Okay. So something else I was going to say about all that, but it's an annoying thing about making these videos. As soon as I press stop and I don't edit, then I think of all these things I should have said. So, basically, I'm willing to be fact-checked. I'm willing to be corrected. But people on the left who are fully captured have even more brittleness about their ideology. They cannot tolerate you even saying a single thing that pushes against their beliefs. And so what I found is I'm actually able to have debates with Trump supporters, some of whom are very close friends, and they have a sense of humor about it. They don't threaten to cancel me. They don't get mad at me, even though they vociferously disagree. But when it comes to these brittle church ladies on the far left, they can't tolerate any heresy whatsoever. So that tells you that they are completely captured by an ideology, by a mass psychosis. However, they're just not as dangerous, though they are dangerous. And so like an example of like how self-righteously punishing they are. Now I'm going on memory. If I've got a fact wrong or about this incident, please correct me. But I had recently become, like a couple of years ago, impressed with some of the fantasy writings of Mercedes Lackey. Her name is. She's a woman, I think in her early 70s, who wrote some real groundbreaking LGBTQ, like Renaissance era fantasy novels in the 80s, when that was unheard of at the time, and so forth. And very good quality writing, even though she would write at very high speed and so on. Unlike me, it took me 45 years to get my sci-fi epic parallel journeys right. But I was very perfectionistic about it. But anyway, so Mercedes Lackey, who was in very poor health and almost bedridden, and had been, and so was her husband, and they had both been under extreme quarantine, for the whole COVID thing. And now they were finally able to get out of the house, and she was invited to speak at some kind of sci-fi fantasy convention. And she was on a panel that was praising the dean, considered by many the greatest African-American sci-fi writer of all time, Samuel Delany, who actually went to my high school, Bronx High School of Science, wrote amazing novels like Dahlgren and so on. And she was on that panel praising Samuel Delany to the skies, as she should. And Mercedes Lackey had also been a civil rights advocate from the earliest age. But she, instead of saying person of color, at one point in her talk said colored person. Now remember, this was the correct term for most of the time Mercedes Lackey was alive. Remember the NAACP, the National Association of, Prevention of Cruelty to Colored Persons or whatever. It's right there in the title. I might have that translation of the acronym wrong, but colored persons was like the accepted liberal term that had no pejorative meaning to it. But then suddenly woke folk decided, no, that's not the correct term. Person of color is the correct term. So for some reason, colored person was no longer correct, but person of color, almost the same words, just the order changed, was the only correct term. So when she said colored persons, while praising Samuel Delaney, people in the audience decided that she had committed a racial slur, and now the organizers of the convention basically had her and her husband, because of collective guilt, I guess, perp walked basically out of the convention, escorted to the door, and they took and Samuel Delaney was in the audience, and he said he had no problem with anything she said. But these were like woke white people offended on his behalf, I guess, and they took down they erased the video of the whole panel talk praising Samuel Delaney. So he lost this great testimonial to himself because a racial slur had been uttered during the video. So this is the kind of thing. So if Trump is elected, it's going to be because of wokeism, because it pisses so many people off. And these are the people, many of the friends I know have dreadlocks, and like you would never guess that they would be voting for Trump, but they've been so polarized by the insanity of wokeism. And then you have a lot of people who are some of the best critics of wokeism, but who can no longer be trusted, like the Weinstein brothers, very bright guys, but who have become radicalized toward the right, because this is what happens, is you get exposed to the mass psychosis of one side. I'm sympathetic with Brett Weinstein because he was like kicked out of his position teaching at Evergreen College because they had basically a no whitey day, where if you were white, you could not attend school that day so that persons of color could talk about racism or something. And when he said that wasn't fair, because some of these kids were like from disadvantaged families, some of these white kids, and that had ancestries that had nothing to do with slavery. Why were they had paid their tuition? Why were they being deprived of a day of education? That was considered such a racist heresy that he was fired from his job. But now he's become, and his brother have become radicalized, that enantiodromia, toward now we identify with the collective psychosis on the right, and don't see that side of the collective psychosis, but only that on the left. So the people who are most to be trusted are those who have double-sided shadow vision. Examples would be Sam Harris and Bill Maher, who are able to see insanity on both sides. If you're not seeing insanity on both sides, you're just not fully sane or not paying attention. So this is a very important point. We need double-sided shadow vision, but we also need to see which of these forms of mass psychosis is the more dangerous. And it's the one on the right now. But I don't want to discount the mass psychosis on the left as not dangerous. So another example, I'm not going to try and cover all the bases of all the sins and transgressions of wokeism, because other people have done that and it just would go on too long, and I didn't prepare notes for that or anything. But there's definitely, right now, the Harris campaign is making a huge mistake because they're allowing all these, the Trump campaign is spending millions of dollars on, tens of millions of dollars even, on one specific ad about prisoners getting free trans surgery. And that was a policy that actually started under the Trump administration. But the Lincoln Project has come up with some response ads, but somehow, and the Trump campaign is very effectively running these ads during football games to further polarize, the more young males. And this is another, let me finish this thought first. Let's finish the trans thing, and then I'll get into like the toxic masculinity thing. So, this is crazy to allow that to happen, and for Harris not to have a sister soldier moment, because she was asked about that by Brett Baer, who suddenly was a somewhat the most respectable of the Fox journalists, but had become like a Trump attack dog during his interview with her. And when asked about that, she should have said, "Yeah, I'm against using taxpayer dollars to pay for sex change operations for people in jail because of being criminals. This is an expensive medical procedure. Why should trans people?" And two of my closest friends are trans. One is a Gen Z, one is a millennial. But they're very authentically trans people, and there have always been trans people. And it's great that there's been a cultural awakening to that these are real people who did not choose that orientation for the most part. But then an antiodromia, to where now we have an immense social contagion thing going on, where suddenly a much higher percentage, an unrealistically high percentage of high school age kids are discovering that they're trans. Nobody knows what the real percentage would be, but social contagion is definitely part of it. And we've seen this happen. Like, for example, I think it was in Hong Kong. They had never had any reported instances of anorexia nervosa and certain other eating disorders until they had a television documentary on that phenomenon in the USA, and suddenly it started to happen there. So you have kids who are really suffering because they are borderline personality types. They're very confused about their identity. Maybe there are a white kid who has no status in a blue area that's very left leaning, because they are not a member of any high status victim group. Like, they're not a person of color. They're not, they don't have anything that they can claim to be discriminated against, but they can immediately jump up several positions in status by declaring themselves trans, and then they must be given all kinds of special consideration. Now, obviously, if they were in the South, they would suffer horrible discrimination, and trans people historically have suffered, horrifying discrimination. But in some circles, that would gain you status. And if you're a confused adolescent, you're well aware of status issues, okay? And maybe you're just confused and unsure about your own identity. But then there are some areas where, and I know the numbers are probably exaggerated on the right, but, and I am not an expert on this, but there are some places where, like I think maybe even the American Psychiatric Association says if a kid declares they are a different gender, you must immediately affirm that, and then, offer puberty blockers and this kind of thing, which have permanent effects, can make somebody unable to achieve orgasm or to be sterile for the rest of their lives. I mean, these are highly consequential decisions. We usually don't allow kids, while they're in a confused early adolescent state, to make permanent life-changing decisions. It's understood that there's confusion going on at that age, but based just on their declaration, they will be put on puberty blockers that will have vast medical ramifications and so on. So I can't sort through all the exaggerations on the right about trans issues. There's some of that going on for sure. But there is also social contagion and mass psychosis going on related to that on the left. And then that is used, so these two forms of mass psychosis can then synergistically feed on each other, because if you're a white guy, you're being told that you're a racist and you're a misogynist and so forth, and because masculinity is viewed in much of of the left as a kind of toxic thing. Boys are normal boy behavior is judged as toxic, and by the way, there is this idea that it's all in amongst the secular humanist, not secular humanist, but the moral relativist folks. This is what's taught in colleges and universities, that gender and everything is all like just a cultural artifact, not rooted in biology. I had this happen when I was canvassing door to door for this nonprofit that was helping Islamic women. And I would be told when I would point out these horrible things going on, well, that's their culture. Okay, if you're a woman having your face burned off, I don't think you are feeling comforted by the fact that you're having a culturally authentic experience. So this is the idea that's taught in colleges and universities of moral relativism. Okay, I don't care what your culture is. If you want to burn women's faces off, you're wrong from the point of view of universal ethics. Okay, at that point, screw your culture. You don't have the right to do that to people. So, but they would tell me that in all seriousness, because this is what they had been taught in colleges and universities and so forth. And they were also taught that gender is just an artificial cultural construct. But now we know that is absolutely not true. That if you take kids from Scandinavian countries where they are taught, the most gender equal ideologies imaginable, boys, even chimpanzees, will show the same preference by gender of toys, male to female. Girls would be more likely to play with dolls. Boys would be more likely to do more rough and tumble play and macho-looking action figures and so forth. These are biologically based differences. Now, I had to learn that myself because when I was a child, I instinctivally, just on my own, had the same ideas. I thought that like gender was just that, that if you were raised to be act like a girl, you would act like a girl, and it was not biological. That was just my childish ideology, but it turns out to be wrong. A lot of it was based on a specific case of twin boys, one of whom, due to a highly incompetent doctor, they were both circumcised, but this doctor, in circumcising the other twin boy, destroyed most of his penis. So he was raised as a girl, and it was supposed to be fully well adapted to that role. And this was supposed to be evidence of gender roles as a cultural conditioning and non-biological. But then when they actually looked into that famous case, they found out he was not well adjusted at all. He was identifying as a male and was very confused and so on. I had a trans friend, I wrote about it in my piece on AI and the singularity archetype, who was probably intersexed, which is much more common than people think. And because subtractive surgery was easier, there are males who are born with it's only all fetuses start out as female, and then based on like testosterone versus estrogen, you become more male or more female, but sometimes there's an ambiguous result. And so that's a very real category of the intersexed. And some of those might be considered trans because of a real biological difference. And she was one of those. Anyway, but masculinity has been interpreted as toxic. Now, I am not among those people on the right who are like, see red at the term toxic masculinity. There is toxic masculinity. That should be obvious. And Donald Trump is an epitome of toxic masculinity, and so is J.D. Vance and so forth. However, equal time should be given to toxic femininity. That's a very real thing too. But we had stuff like the Me Too movement where we need to, which was a great thing, but like most of these great things, like recognizing trans is a valid thing, then it overcorrects. There's this enantiodromia where now we have to believe women. Okay, Did women lose the capacity to lie and bear false witness suddenly? I'm not familiar with that. There are false accusations. I witnessed that happen at a place that I worked at of a woman who kept making false accusations against men. That's as old as the hills, too. Again, there are perpetrators and victims on both sides. If you can only see men wearing the black hats and women wearing the white hats, you're just totally confused. Okay? To be fair, there are more violently abusive men by far than violently abusive women. But that doesn't mean that there aren't some. And we have to be careful because men don't have the monopoly on toxic behavior and lying. So this is just a quick off-the-cuff survey of some of the things that cause that actually cause collective psychosis on the right. Because if Trump wins, it will be because of this kind of abuse, where you have a bunch of angry men who've been told that they're racist and that they're misogynists and that they're wrong for being males and so forth. The Democratic National Committee, I think it was in 2016, put out an ad for people to do computer work. Okay? And they said, if you're a cisgendered white male, don't even apply. Wow. So, I mean, this is the kind of total ignorance, just like the pro-Hamas protesters on college campuses. Are they going to stop Israel from doing what it's doing by their protests on American campuses? Israel is not going away. Okay, they've got over 200 nuclear weapons. Okay, what you are doing is you're actually helping to elect Donald Trump by people seeing that you're completely nonsensical. Like people were wearing like queers for Hamas shirts and so forth. Like Hamas would throw you off the nearest building if you showed up wearing a shirt like that. So the Hamas is like completely anti-female and completely committed to ethnic genocide. Okay, I'm not saying that there aren't atrocities being committed on the other side. It's complex. But people don't like complexity. What they like is mass psychosis, which gives them a feeling of they know all the answers, they're wearing the white hat, and somebody else is wearing the black hat. And that is the great danger, is mass psychosis. It's on the left and it's on the right, and the two feed on each other.